The maintenance drone found the first one wedged behind a coolant pipe on Deck 9, and vessel custodian Reln almost didn't report it because it made no sense. It was a spoon. A human eating utensil, bent nearly in half, the handle sharpened to a point against something rough. It had been hidden with deliberate care in a place no scanner swept and no officer walked. Reln turned it over in 3 fingers. The metal was warm. Not from heat. From being held. He filed it under debris, non-hazardous, and moved on. By the end of the cycle, the drones had found 211 more. The humans had surrendered everything. That was the part the Concorde could not stop repeating to itself, in briefing after briefing, as though repetition might dissolve the wrongness of it. 40 days earlier, the Assembly of 9 Voices had issued the disarmament compact to the newly contacted species of the 3rd planet, and Earth had complied. Fully. Without the ritual negotiation, without the theatrical resistance every young species performed before yielding. They had loaded every warship, every railgun, every fission device, every last kinetic lance into orbital freighters and flown them, unescorted, into Concorde custody. Overseer Vashti had watched the manifest scroll for 6 hours and felt something she had no word for. They kept nothing, said her aide, Ilu, a slender Kale whose species measured trust in the length of silences. We verified against their own industrial records. Their foundries are cold. Their arsenals are empty. Overseer, they gave us the keys to their own extinction. Species do not do this, Vashti said. This one did. Vashti did not answer. She was looking at a single line near the bottom of the manifest, an entry that had been logged, then flagged, then logged again by a confused clerk. Facility designation, unlisted. Location, subsurface, continental interior. Status, sealed by the humans. Contents, undeclared. What is that? She said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a door she did not want to open. They call it the vault, Il said. They have asked us not to make them open it. And there it was. The first thing that did not fit. A species that had handed over the instruments of its own destruction without complaint had drawn one line, one only, around a thing it would not name. Then we will make them open it, Vashti said. She would spend the rest of her life understanding that sentence. Corporal Maro Yellerin was 34 years old and had not fired a weapon in 6 weeks, and her hands still curled around a rifle that was no longer there. She stood in the receiving yard of what had been Fort Kearney and was now Concorde Administrative Holding Site 12, watching alien loaders stack the last crates of humanity's arsenal onto a lifter the size of a cathedral. She was not supposed to feel anything. That was the whole point of the arrangement. Peace, they'd been told. Integration. A seat, eventually, at the table of older and wiser things. Beside her, Sergeant Dell spat into the dust. Feels like handing a mugger your knife and saying thanks for the lesson. It's not a mugging if you agreed to it, Mara said. Did we agree or did we get told? She didn't answer. She was watching the Concorde liaison, a tall gray thing called Reln, a custodian, which as far as she could tell meant a soldier who counted spoons, moved down the line of surrendered humans with a scanner. Every so often he paused. Frowned, if that flat face could frown. Made a note. He stopped in front of Mara. You have surrendered your service weapon, Reln said. His translated voice was soft, almost apologetic. I have. And your sidearm? Yes. And yet. He tilted his head. Your record indicates you were, before contact, an instructor. In what your files call close quarters improvisation. He looked up. You teach soldiers to fight without weapons. I teach soldiers to fight when the weapons are gone, Mara said. There's a difference. Reln was quiet for a long moment. Then he wrote something down, and something in the careful way he did it made the hair rise on the back of her neck. What did you just write? She said. He looked at her with those wide gray eyes. A question, he said. For my overseer. And he moved on down the line. Vashti read Reln's report at the 3rd hour of the sleep cycle and did not sleep afterward. Anomaly, he had written. The humans surrendered their weapons. They did not surrender their fighters. Recommend we clarify whether the compact distinguishes between the two. I do not believe the humans think it does. She summoned the human representative to the orbital station. His name was Secretary Adissa Cone, an old man with gray at his temples and a stillness that reminded her, uncomfortably, of Ilu's silences. He sat across from her in the negotiation chamber with his hands folded, and he waited for her to speak first, which no young species ever did. You have complied with the compact, Vashti said. We have. Completely. Yes. Then explain to me the sealed facility. The one you call the vault. Cone's expression did not change. The compact required the surrender of weapons. The vault contains no weapons. I have certified this. My government has certified this. Our surrender is total and honest. Then why will you not open it? For the first time, something moved behind the old man's eyes. Not fear. Vashti had catalogued fear across 400 species and knew its every dialect. This was something else. It looked almost like grief. Because, Cone said slowly, if we open it, we can never close it again. And I had hoped, we had all hoped, that this time we would not have to. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have that you would believe. He rose. Overseer, you asked us to disarm, and we disarmed. I am asking you, one elder to another, not to ask us for the last thing. Not because we would refuse you. Because we would not. He left, and Vashti sat alone in the chamber and realized she understood nothing. The order to breach the vault came from the assembly 11 days later, over Vashti's formal objection. The logic was flawless, which was the trouble with the assembly's logic. It was always flawless and it was frequently wrong. A disarmed species with a single sealed facility it would not open was, by definition, a species concealing a weapon. The compact permitted verification. Verification would be performed. Reln was assigned to lead the inspection team down into the Earth, and Mara Yellerin, because she was cleared and local and spoke the liaison's cadence, was assigned to escort him. They descended for 2 hours. The vault was not what Reln expected, and he had learned, in his weeks among these creatures, to distrust his expectations. He had expected a bunker, a silo, the cold geometry of a doomsday device. Instead, the elevator opened onto a corridor of white stone that went down and down, lined with alcoves, and in each alcove sat an object under soft light, labeled in a dozen human scripts. What is this place? He said. Mara's face had gone strange, reverent and sick at once. You really want to know? The compact requires. I know what it requires. She stepped past him into the corridor. She stopped at the first alcove. Inside, on a cushion, lay a jawbone. Ancient, pierced by a spear point of chipped flint that had fused with the bone across uncountable years. This is Cabra too, she said quietly. A man who lived 60,000 years ago. Someone put a stone spear through his face, and he lived. The bone healed around the point. He lived years, they think. With that in him. She moved to the next alcove. A child's crutch, hand-carved, worn smooth. Tut's cane. A king who was born with a ruined foot and ruled anyway. The next. A rusted helmet, split down the crown. This man took an axe to the skull at a bridge called Stamford and got up and kept swinging. I do not understand, Reln said, and his voice came out smaller than he intended. Mara kept walking, and he followed her because he could not do otherwise, deeper into the light. When you told us to give you our weapons, she said, we gave them to you. Every gun. Every bomb. We did it because we've done it before, custodian. We've been disarmed before, by winters, by plagues, by empires bigger than us, by each other. She stopped. This is where we keep the answer to the only question that has ever actually mattered to my species. The question every winter and plague and empire eventually asks us. What question? Reln whispered. She turned to face him. What do you have left when everything that keeps you alive is taken away? And she gestured down the corridor, which ran on into the dark farther than his eyes could follow, alcove after alcove after alcove, 10,000 small monuments to the same impossible thing. Reln understood, then, that the vault contained no weapon. The vault contained proof. It was a library, curated across 200,000 years, Of every time a human being should have died and simply, stubbornly, catastrophically, refused. He fell behind. He did not want her to see his hands shaking. Reln's report reached Vasht in fragments, because he stopped it 3 times to steady himself, and the gaps between transmissions frightened her more than the content. There is no weapon here, he sent. Overseer, I must correct my earlier assessment. I was looking for the wrong category of thing. This is not a place where they keep a weapon. This is a place where they keep the reason they have never needed to be afraid of losing their weapons. Then, an hour later, I have found the second half of the vault. The old half was memory. The new half is instruction. Overseer, they have been recording, not history. There are 10,000 human hours here on a single subject, and I have only just understood what the subject is. Then nothing for a long time. Vash paced. Illa watched her pace. When the final transmission came, it was only 1 line. The subject is how to keep going after the point at which continuing is no longer rational. And Overseer, they teach it to their children. Vash read it 4 times. And a cold thing uncoiled in her, because she remembered, suddenly, a detail from the very first manifest, a detail she had dismissed. 211 sharpened spoons, hidden throughout the surrendered fleet. Weapons made from eating utensils, concealed by soldiers who had already agreed to be disarmed. They had not been cheating the compact. They had not been planning an uprising. Reln's own follow-up, filed weeks ago and buried under more urgent matters, surfaced in her memory now with terrible clarity. He had asked one of the prisoners why he'd made the spoon, when there was no enemy, no war, no possible use for it. The human had looked at him like the question was insane. Because someday there might be, the man had said, and I want my hands to remember how. They had not been arming themselves. They had been practicing being unkillable, as a reflex, as a devotion, in peacetime, for no reason, the way other species breathed. Vash said. The assembly believed we disarmed the humans. We did disarm them, Overseer. No, Vash stared at the last line of Reln's report. We took their weapons. We never touched the thing that makes them dangerous. We didn't even know it existed. She stood very still. We have spent 40 days confiscating the one part of them that never mattered. The assembly did not believe her. This was the second mistake, and it was worse than the first, because the first had been made in ignorance and the second was made in the full light of Reln's report. The 9 voices convened and reviewed the footage from the vault, the jawbone, the crutch, the 10,000 hours of instruction, and they concluded, with flawless logic, that a species which had built a temple to its own refusal to die was a species that must be, in some hidden way, still armed. The vault was reclassified, not as a museum, as a doctrine facility. And doctrine, the assembly reasoned, could be confiscated the same as any other weapon. They ordered the vault emptied. Every artifact, every recording, transferred to Concord custody. And they ordered its curators, the small order of humans who had tended the place for generations, taken into protective detention so that the doctrine could not be taught to anyone new. Secretary Cohn received the order in person from Vasht, who insisted on delivering it herself because she could not stomach doing it by proxy. I argued against this, she told him. You should know that. I told them what your vault is. I told them it is not a weapon. And they heard it is not a weapon we can control, Cohn said. He did not seem surprised. He seemed, if anything, unbearably tired. Overseer, may I tell you the thing I did not tell you before? The reason I hoped you would never make us open it. Tell me. Because a weapon that sits in a vault is safe. He looked at her. The moment you take it out, the moment you tell 8 billion human beings that the aliens have come to confiscate the memory of every ancestor who refused to die, you have not disarmed us. His voice did not rise. That was the terrible part. You have distributed us. You have taken the one thing we kept in a single sealed room and made it live in every human alive at once. Vasht felt the floor of her certainty give way. You misunderstand your own compliance, Cohn said gently. We did not surrender because we were beaten. We surrendered because surrender costs us nothing. Our weapons were never in the arsenals, Overseer. The arsenals were the disposable part. That's why we gave them up so easily. He rose, and for the first time an old soldier stood inside the old diplomat. You asked for the last thing. I begged you not to. And now you are going to reach into the vault and pull out the one part of us we know how to survive without weapons with. The extraction went wrong on the third day, and it went wrong quietly, which was how Mara knew it was real. There was no uprising. That was what the Concord kept waiting for and never got. The humans did not riot when the curators were detained. They did not attack the transport columns hauling the artifacts up from the Earth. What they did was worse, and it took the Concord 4 days to even perceive it as an action at all. They watched. Every human within reach of a screen watched the footage, leaked, deliberately, by the curators in the hour before their detention, of gray aliens carrying a 60,000-year-old jawbone up out of the dark. And something moved through 8 billion people that had no command structure, no leader, no weapon, and could not be confiscated because it did not exist in any single place. Mara felt it happen to herself. She was standing in the receiving yard at Site 12 when the footage reached her, and she watched Sergeant Dell watch it, and she saw the exact moment his face changed. Not to rage. To recognition. I know that feeling, Dell said quietly. What feeling? The one where they take the last thing. He rolled his shoulders, and Mara heard his spine crack, and she understood that he was not preparing to fight. He was settling in to endure, the way you settle in for a march with no known end. My granddad had it. In the camps. He used to say the moment they take everything, that's the moment they've got nothing left to threaten you with. Reln was standing 10 paces away, and he heard it, and Mara watched the custodian go very still. That is not a strategy, Reln said. It cannot be a strategy. There is no plan. There is no coordination. There is no weapon. No, Mara agreed. There isn't. Then what is happening? She looked at him with something close to pity. You took away the reason we were being careful, she said. For 100 years we've held ourselves back, custodian, treaties, restraint, civilization, all the machinery a species builds to stop itself from becoming the thing in that vault. She nodded up at the sky, at the transports carrying her ancestors' bones into orbit. You just spent 40 days dismantling every piece of that machinery. You took the weapons that made us feel safe enough to be gentle. And now you've reached for the memory that reminds us we don't need to be. The first Concord death was an accident, and it was the accident that Vashti had been dreading since Cohn's warning, because it proved him right. A transport hauling artifacts from a secondary vault in the Andean highlands lost power over a mountain pass and set down for repairs in a valley of subsistence farmers who had no weapons, no military training, and no reason on any rational calculus to interfere with a Concord vessel carrying enough automated defense to level their town. They interfered anyway. Not with guns. With bodies. 800 people walked out of the valley and stood in front of the transport and did not move, and when the security detail deployed non-lethal dispersal, they endured it, and when the detail escalated, they endured that, and the footage that came out of that valley, of human beings absorbing punishment that should have broken any species and simply standing back up, over and over, for 11 hours, reached the rest of Earth by nightfall. And Earth understood it as instruction. Reln reviewed the valley footage with Mara at his side, because he had begun, without deciding to require her presence to make sense of his own species' confusion. He watched a woman get put down by a dispersal round and rise and get put down and rise, and he counted, and he stopped counting at 40. Why, he said. His voice broke on the word. There is nothing in that transport but bones. They cannot use the bones. They cannot fight with a museum. Why would they die for it? Mara watched the woman rise a 41st time. They're not dying for the bones, she said. They're not even dying for the vault. You still think this is about the thing in the room. She turned to him. It was never about the thing in the room, Reln. The vault was just where we kept the demonstration. What you're watching in that valley isn't people protecting a museum. She said it very softly, and it was the softness that made it land. It's the museum's newest exhibit, filming itself. Reln understood, and the understanding took the strength out of his legs, and he sat down hard on the ground of a planet he had helped to disarm. Every human who suffered and refused to stop was not defending the archive. They were adding to it. The vault had never been a building. The building was just the seed. And the Concord, by trying to empty it, had planted it in 8 billion people at once, had turned the entire species into the very thing it had spent 40 days trying to remove. Vashti went before the assembly a final time, and this time she did not argue logic, because she had finally understood that logic was the trap. You believe, she told the 9 voices, that a species can be disarmed by removing its weapons. This is true of every species we have ever contacted. It is not true of this one. This one keeps its weapon in a place we cannot reach, because the weapon is the reaching, the refusal to stop reaching after the arm is broken, after the hand is gone. She let that settle. We did not disarm humanity. We performed a demonstration for 8 billion students on the exact circumstance their entire culture is built to survive. We are not their conquerors. We have become their curriculum. The first voice, who had never in 4 centuries been wrong in a way it would admit, said, "Then we will apply greater force. Every species has a threshold. We will find theirs." "They do not have a threshold," Vashti said. "That is the finding. That is the entire content of the vault. 200,000 years of data, first voice, and every entry says the same thing. There is no amount of force that produces surrender, only an amount that produces a smaller number of humans, each of whom is now certain." She looked at the 9 faces of the oldest power in the galaxy. You are not looking for their breaking point. You are looking for a breaking point that their entire civilization exists to prove does not exist. And every time you push, you are not defeating the belief. You are confirming it. In front of all of them. At once. Silence, in the chamber of the 9 voices, for the first time in living memory. The order came down anyway. Of course it did. Vashti had known it would, because the tragedy of the assembly was not cruelty but momentum, the inability of a perfect logic engine to stop a course of action simply because it had become horror. Greater force was applied. And here is the thing that broke the Concord, the thing that no strategist had modeled, because no strategist had understood what the vault actually was. Greater force did not produce fear. It produced volunteers. The curators, released, then redetained, then irrelevant, because the doctrine was loose now and could not be recaged, issued a single final broadcast before they went silent for good. It was not a call to arms. It was a list of instructions, the oldest instructions in the archive, and Mara knew them before the translation finished because she had learned them as a child without ever knowing where they came from. How to stand when standing is over. How to hold a line with no line and no reason. How to make your body a page. Sergeant Dell walked out of Site 12 the next morning with no weapon and did not come back. Mara knew where he'd gone. She'd known since the valley footage changed his face. She found Reln at the perimeter fence, watching the roads fill with people walking, not marching, walking, in the loose, relentless way of a species that had decided to keep going and had no particular schedule for stopping. "Your overseer was right," Mara said. "About all of it. I want you to know that. Somebody on your side saw it clearly at the end." "It does not help," Reln said hollowly. "She saw it and could not stop it." "No," Mara watched the roads. "That's the other thing about us. Your vault doesn't have room to explain properly, custodian. Seeing it clearly has never once stopped us either. We saw the winters coming. We saw the plagues. We saw every empire that ate us. Clear sight is not the break you think it is." She almost smiled. "We're not the species that doesn't understand the cost. We're the species that understood the cost and kept going anyway. That's what the whole vault is. 200,000 years of people who did the math and stood up regardless." The turning point, when it came, was not a battle. Vashti would spend the rest of her long life insisting on this to anyone who would listen, because the galaxy wanted it to have been a battle, and it was not. It was a single image, and it went everywhere at once. A Concord officer, in the 3rd month, cornered a group of unarmed humans in a collapsed transit station and gave the order to disperse them permanently, and one of the humans, an old woman, no soldier, no curator, nobody the archive had ever heard of, stepped in front of the others and did the oldest thing in the vault. She opened her empty hands. She showed the officer she had nothing. And then she took one step forward. The officer fired. She fell. And the person behind her opened their empty hands and took one step forward. And the person behind them. The footage ran for 9 minutes before the officer's weapon overheated, and by then the Concorde soldier, a veteran of 40 pacifications across a dozen worlds, was on his knees, not because he had been attacked, because he had not once, but because he had finally understood what he was looking at, and his mind, built by a civilization that measured strength in the capacity to make others stop, could not hold it. They would not stop. There was no threat left to make. There was no weapon left to take. They had surrendered the guns and the bombs and the fleets and the last sealed vault of their own history. They had given up every single thing a rational species defends, and standing in the rubble with empty hands, they were more dangerous than they had ever been armed, because now there was nothing left to threaten, and a species you cannot threaten is a species you cannot rule. The officer's transmission, when it came, was 3 words, and it reached every corner of the Concorde before anyone could suppress it, and it ended the war more completely than any weapon in the confiscated arsenals ever could have. They are winning. The assembly sued for peace in the 4th month, which was an absurdity, because they had not been defeated in any way their own doctrine could name. No fleet had beaten them. No weapon had touched them. They had simply looked for 111 days at a species that would not stop coming with open hands, and the oldest civilization in the galaxy had discovered the one thing it could not endure, being witnessed by something that would not break. Vasht was the one who signed it, because no one else could stand to. The terms were simple. The vault would be returned. Every artifact. Every bone. The old woman from the transit station would be added to it. Her image, her empty hands, her single step, and Vasht understood, signing, that she was not returning to a museum. She was returning the seed, intact, and that the Concorde would spend the rest of its existence knowing exactly where it was and being unable to do anything about it, because they had learned, at a cost that ran into the millions, that the one thing you must never do to a human being is take away the last thing. Because humans keep something behind the last thing. They keep the willingness to lose it and continue. Mara was there when they brought the jawbone back down into the earth. Relm carried it himself. He had asked to. It was the closest thing to an apology his species had, and both of them knew it was not enough, and both of them knew nothing would be. He set the 60,000-year-old bone back on its cushion, the flint spear point still fused into it, the mark of the wound that should have killed a man before history began and simply, stubbornly, did not. "How many?" Relm said quietly. "In your valleys? Your stations? The roads? How many did you lose?" Mara told him. It was a number with a great many digits, and the cost of it lived in the flat, exhausted way she said it, and in the fact that Sergeant Dell was one of the digits and she did not say his name because she could not. "You won," Relm said. "Do you understand that? You won a war against the oldest power in the galaxy with your bare hands." "I know what it cost," Mara said. "Don't tell me we won." They stood together in the white corridor, under the soft lights, the 200,000 years of small monuments running off into the dark on either side. Relm looked down the length of it, at all the impossible wounds healed, and he asked the last question, the one his whole species would be asking for the rest of its existence. "Why," he said, "I have to understand it. Not the vault. Not the doctrine. When we took everything, when there was no weapon, no hope, no reason, why did you keep standing up?" Mara was quiet for a long time. Then she reached into her pocket and took out a spoon, bent nearly in half. The handle sharpened to a point against something rough, warm from being held. "Because someday there might be a reason," she said, "and I want my hands to remember how." She set it down in an empty alcove, at the very end of the corridor, where the light gave way to the dark that had not yet been filled. Then she turned and walked back up toward the surface, toward the road still full of people walking, and Relm stood alone in the deepest room of humanity for a long time, in a silence his own species had no word for, holding the terrible and permanent knowledge that the galaxy had spent 40 days taking every weapon from the one species that had never, in 200,000 years, actually needed one.